Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, the Ghostbusters are back, and this time they're facing a new enemy that wants to turn the world into his frozen empire. The Spenglers, Mother Callie, played by Carrie Coon, her boyfriend Gary, played by Paul Rudd, son Trevor, played by Finn Wolfhard, and daughter Phoebe, played by McKenna Grace, have taken over the old family ghostbusting business in the old New York firehouse. When Nadeem, played by Kumail Nanjiani, donates his grandmother's belongings to Ray Stantz, played by Dan Aykroyd, he passes over an orb containing the god Garaka, an entity feared even by other ghosts. After Garaka is unleashed, he threatens to plunge the world into a frozen apocalypse, and the only ones who can stop him are the Ghostbusters, old and new. Now, you might recall that I had some very strong opinions on Ghostbusters Afterlife, which is to say, I didn't like it very much. I'm a fan of the original 1984 film, as you can tell, as well as its first immediate sequel to a lesser extent, but Afterlife really rubbed me the wrong way for a variety of reasons, the first being the CGI resurrection of Harold Ramis, which I thought was downright ghoulish, even though it claimed to be a tribute, but also just tonally, the movie was very strange to me. It treated this pop culture property with very undue reverence for a comedy franchise. It treated something like Star Wars, and it just felt completely off, and then it turned into just a scene-for-scene remake of the original 1984 film. Ghostbusters is very strange as a franchise, because you could do so much with it, but every time they try and make a movie about it, they just keep circling back around to the original 1984 film and doing the same ideas over and over again. It's very frustrating. So for those reasons, I wasn't looking forward to Frozen Empire, as it's a direct sequel to Afterlife from much of the same creative team. Stepping into the director's chair this time is Gil Keenan, who previously directed Monster House. He also directed Bill Murray in City of Ember. He steps into the director's chair after Jason Reitman stepped down. Jason Reitman directed Afterlife. His father Ivan directed the first two Ghostbusters movies. After that movie was released, Ivan passed away shortly thereafter. Understandably, Jason decided to step back from helming the sequel, so Keenan steps in his place, especially because he's a co-writer on both this movie and Afterlife. He and Reitman wrote the screenplays together. Reitman is also a producer on the movie, alongside his late father, who is also listed as a producer, and the film is dedicated to him. Is it an improvement on Afterlife? In my personal opinion, I think it is. I like this a bit more than I did Afterlife, but it's still got some substantial problems. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire got me on side relatively early on because they got the tone right, for the most part. Afterlife took itself way too seriously, and it seems like the filmmakers have actually sat down and listened to the complaints about that, and have put the humour more forward this time out. It feels more like a comedy, which immediately makes it feel more like an actual Ghostbusters movie. There's also something to be said about the fact that it's now back in New York, or at least nominally. In actuality, most of Frozen Empire filmed in London because that's how tax breaks work, and filming in New York is very expensive. Unfortunately, that does mean that the movie doesn't really have a lot of authentic New York flavour, which you can definitely find in the first two movies in abundance. But nevertheless, there is something to be said about having Ghostbusters back in its original iconic locations. It immediately feels like it's back in a comfy pair of slippers, especially because it means that the film can go back to even more references to the original 1984 film, getting the opportunity to reference all the things they couldn't do in Afterlife, like the library ghost, and etc, and etc. Although I will say that most of these references are more on the kind of cute side, more than anything, so I tolerated them. And, you know, they're fun, they're momentary, they don't really distract too much from the movie. And the opening action sequence is fun, where they're driving around in Ecto-1 and they're chasing after the sewer dragon. That makes you feel like you're watching a Ghostbusters movie. And the core concept of Ghostbusters is one of the reasons why the franchise has endured so long. The idea of catching ghosts, it appeals to both kids and adults. There are kids that are fans of Ghostbusters that weren't even a twinkle in their grandparents' eyes when the original film came out. I wasn't even born when the original film came out. Ghostbusters is one of those things that gets passed down from their parents to their children, and so it's understandable why the new movies have a very generational approach that appeals to both new and old viewers simultaneously. And one of the fun things about a new Ghostbusters movie is new technology, the way that they try and put new spins on the old traps, a trap in a drone and so on and so forth. That stuff is fun. I don't geek out about it like the real hardcore fans do, but I do think it's enjoyable to see that kind of creativity in the premise. And to that end, we got Ernie Hudson's Winston, who is overseeing a new research centre in an abandoned aquarium. And clearly this is all very franchise-minded. When you're watching these scenes, you can tell they're putting in the building blocks for expanding this franchise further, maybe having multiple sets of teams, or spinning off in different directions, or going into different cities, and having this as maybe a home base or something like that. There are a lot of different possibilities here, but also introducing different kinds of ghosts and different kinds of entities. You can tell they've taken a lot of inspiration from the real Ghostbusters TV series, and that's a good place to be taking ideas from, because as many fans of the series really think of those cartoons as much as the original two films, and in many ways the animated spin-offs of Ghostbusters are more successful attempts at trying to expand the world of the films than anything that has been done in the live-action realm so far. And while I'm very critical of Afterlife being a pseudo-remake of the 1984 film, that doesn't mean that you can't bring back old elements so long as you use them in the right way and justify them. Ray is a great example of this. Dan Aykroyd looks absolutely jazzed to be at the centre of a brand new Ghostbusters movie. I mean, why wouldn't he? It's his baby, after all, and he looks like he's having the most fun out of anyone. In fact, I think that Aykroyd is probably the most energetic and lively that I've seen in a film in probably over 2 decades here. If you're going to keep bringing back the old cast members, maybe limit it down to Aykroyd and Hudson, who are clearly the most passionate about this new iteration. And let it also be said, it's really great that Ernie Hudson is finally getting his due in Ghostbusters. Winston has always been chronically underappreciated, and it's nice to see him getting a big prominent role in these movies. I wish that he got a bigger part in this one. It does seem like some of his stuff has been left on the cutting room floor. We'll get to that in a little bit. But some of the scenes between Ray and Winston, they're some of the best scenes in the movie. The scenes where they're talking about, yeah, maybe they're a little bit past it, maybe they need to retire, but they're still passionate about this stuff. That stuff really works on an emotional level for those older viewers. But it's also clear that some of those older cast members maybe don't actually want to come back. Bill Murray in particular pops up intermittently, and it feels like he's mostly here out of polite obligation, or maybe even just plain contractual obligation. He's kind of fun in a little cameo-like scene midway through the movie, but he pops back up again in time for the climax, and Murray just looks incredibly lost in the big CGI-ness of it all. It becomes very clear that he doesn't know where to place his eyeline or what he's reacting to. He mostly just looks confused a lot of the time. And Annie Potts also turns up once again, and it's nice to see Janine Farley in a jumpsuit in a live-action version of this franchise. I mean, that's mostly a bone for the fans, because the character doesn't really do all that much. She doesn't get to bust a ghost by herself or anything like that. And that's the thing. It feels like they have to get the old band back together just simply for the fan base, instead of actually giving them something to do. And speaking of the comedy, one of the more successful new elements, in my opinion, is Kumail Nanjiani's character, who becomes more pivotal as the movie progresses. He kind of sets the plot in motion and then disappears until about roughly halfway through, and then he becomes a major character from that point forward. And Nanjiani, I think, has the right energy for Ghostbusters, in that his character has to deal with this big epic fantasy storyline, but he's dealing with it in this very kind of low-key, almost awkward fashion, and that's always been what Ghostbusters is about, that kind of irreverent spirit, almost shrugging off the kind of more fantastical elements with a kind of strange world weariness. That's always been the heart of the humour at these movies, and I think that Nanjiani nails that. While it is admittedly a spin on the Rick Moranis character from the original 1984 film, it's not replaying the same arc over again. Instead, it takes that kind of idea and then turns it into something completely different. And that's how you do it. That's how you try and make new things out of old properties, is that you expand upon them and maybe take ideas in a different direction. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of things that kind of nod to the fact that we're doing a bit of Rick Moranis. There's the bit where he's wearing the colander on his head, because you remember that thing, right? But for the most part, the movie gets it. And I liked what they did with this character. In fact, I would say the movie's actually at its best when it's doing the ghost-busting stuff. That's the stuff the audience wants to see. And unfortunately, there's not as much of that as you would hope. And the reason why that is because there's far too much plot. There is plot out of this movie's ears. And I can be very sympathetic towards that, because let's break this down, shall we? Let's look at the cast of characters this movie has to deal with. Okay, so they bring back the Afterlife main cast, so that's 2 parents and the 4 kids that are Ghostbusters. That's 6 main characters right there. They bring back the OG Ghostbusters. That's 4 more characters. That's 10, and that's all Ghostbusters by themselves. Then they bring back William Atherton as Walter Peck. This time, he's the mayor of New York, and he's kind of doing the same old motions, but he's a secondary antagonist. That's our 11th character. Then we've got 2 or 3 more new characters to the cast. That's about 14 or so. And then we've got the movie's big bad. That's the 15th. Can you imagine trying to write a movie that has 15 major characters in it in speaking roles? That's an absolute nightmare. I don't envy that in the slightest. And trying to give every single one of those characters something to do, and unfortunately that weighs down the movie heavier than a proton pack, because in a 2-hour movie, not everyone's going to get the same level of screen time, and that does mean that there are quite a few cast members that show up and have virtually nothing to do. By far some of the biggest casualties of this are the Spenglers themselves, who are ostensibly the main characters, but pretty much everyone that isn't named Phoebe is massively underserved by this sequel, especially the 2 adult characters played by Carrie Coon and Paul Rudd. Coon has virtually nothing to play in this movie other than periodically pouting about her teenage daughter's rebelliousness. Meanwhile, Paul Rudd is squandered yet again in this movie. One of my biggest complaints about Afterlife is that Paul Rudd is a fantastic bit of casting. He's the natural descendant of someone like Bill Murray or Dan Aykroyd in their prime. He is a great fit for a Ghostbusters movie, and instead in the last film they decide to make him into Rick Moranis. This time he is actually a Ghostbuster, and then he hardly gets to do any ghostbusting in the movie. He's lumbered with a very cliche subplot about getting Phoebe to accept him as being her new stepdad. This conflict doesn't feel like something that naturally arose from the events of the last movie. It didn't seem like she had a problem with him in Afterlife. It mostly feels like it just exists to have a conflict for this character, to give him something to do, because there isn't anything else in the plot. Paul Rudd actually has top billing for this movie, but there's long stretches where his character just disappears at points. And Finn Wolfhard as Trevor, his subplot is pretty much interacting with Slimer. It feels like the Spenglers might have had a lot of their material left on the cutting room floor, because it's pretty obvious that there's a lot of bits from the trailers that didn't make it into the final cut of the movie, and that suggests to me that there was probably a last-ditch attempt to try and bring this movie under 2 hours as a way of trying to tame the number of different subplots that go in various different directions and try and bring it down to a manageable running time. But the problem is that so many characters get reduced to almost cameo roles in the process. They also bring back Podcast and Lucky in different roles. Podcast is hanging out with Ray, Lucky is at the research centre, and the movie kind of has these really tenuous excuses for why these characters are now in New York. Those characters have to kind of be around just simply for the sake of the fact that they were in the last movie, but again, they aren't really given much of a reason to be here in this particular outing, and you probably could have lost them in the process. In fact, there's one moment that makes me wonder, how did Lucky not die in that instance? In terms of the other new cast members, James Acaster, who's making his feature film debut here, actually acquits himself quite well as the main techie at the research centre. It's not a huge role, but I think he has the right approach to the material. He has that right kind of flippantness to his humour, and there is a couple of scary moments with his character that he actually sells properly. I think this character is someone that they could bring back for multiple installments, and it does feel like that's the intention behind him, and massively expand his personality. But they also bring in Patton Oswalt, and I like Patton Oswalt, but he doesn't need to be in this movie. He plays a character in the New York Library who's a massive D&D and Lovecraft fan. He loves the mythology of monsters, and he pops up in the middle of the film to deliver this massive expository speech about the film's big villain. But this character could simply be eliminated from the script. They could merge him with someone that already exists, like Ray or James Acaster's character. It could have eliminated some of the film's bloat by just taking this role out. And instead, Oswald pops up, has a couple of little tiny funny bits, and then just disappears for the rest of the movie. Like, what's the point of making yet another new character in a movie that already has too many major characters to begin with? And I mentioned earlier they bring back Walter Peck, and it's great to see William Atherton playing a smarmy arsehole again, but mostly the role exists largely for him to repeat what he did in the original 1984 film, except this time he's now the mayor, so there's a bit of an element of Kurt Fuller's character from Ghostbusters 2, where he's using his mayoral authority to obstruct the Ghostbusters, and the movie brings him back and kind of sets him up as being a major character, potentially, because he wants to shut down the Ghostbusters, obviously. But then the character kind of pops up intermittently and then appears at the very, very end of the movie, and you would think, given that him and Bill Murray are in the same frame, there would be some fireworks there, and instead, just kind of fizzles. It feels like a character that could have easily been eliminated in another rewrite to bring the focus into where the movie needs to be. It's really telling how crowded this movie is that I've spoken about it for this long, and I haven't even discussed the main character, which is to say, Phoebe. McKenna Grace is one of the best things about Ghostbusters Afterlife. She had those Harold Ramis qualities down in her performance, but also crafted something new out of the character. She was by far its most interesting new creation, so it makes sense the filmmakers realised that she was such an asset and decided to place her even further at the forefront of this sequel. When she starts out at the beginning of the movie, she's doing her usual ghost-busting thing, and she's hanging out the side of a car and she's blasting rather indiscriminately. That gets them brought into Walter Peck, who rather does have a bit of a point that maybe someone who's a minor probably shouldn't be carrying a mini nuclear accelerator on their back, and so she ends up not being able to be a Ghostbuster anymore, at least for the time being, and this causes a bit of an identity crisis for her. If she isn't a Ghostbuster, if she isn't living up to the family legacy, what is she? Who is she? Exactly. And of course, she's 15 now, she's going through her turbulent teens, she's got a bit of a rebellious spirit going on. Phoebe encounters a ghost named Melody, played by Emily Allen Lind, who you might remember from Doctor Sleep, and they strike up a relationship with each other, and that is most definitely the right word here, because there is clearly a very thinly veiled subtext to this entire subplot, but it never quite fully commits to it. But it's pretty clear that this storyline is meant to be the emotional through line to the entire movie, the anchor that all these subplots are meant to hang on and make the movie feel tangible overall, and unfortunately it does not work, and it collapses under that weight. This storyline didn't work for me for several different reasons. The first being that aforementioned coyness. It feels very strange that the movie never fully commits to actually being what it's trying to be about here, and it makes me wonder if Sony themselves balked at it and told the filmmakers, no, you can't do that in a Ghostbusters movie, and they had to rein it in. It feels strangely scared of offending someone here, and it's so neuters the ultimate effect of this subplot, because it never goes beyond, oh, they're just really good friends. If you're gonna make it about that, make it about the thing you want it to be about. Secondly, the movie tips its hand far too early when it comes to Melody's true intentions, revealing them to the audience far earlier than it does to Phoebe, and this dramatic irony really works against the movie. If this plotline is to work, we need to be on the same emotional wavelength as Phoebe, who is very young and naive and trusts Melody implicitly, but unfortunately the movie has already told us that Melody is not to be trusted, so not only is the ultimate betrayal at the end of it vastly diminished, but also it makes Phoebe, who is established to be the smartest character in the entire movie, look like a total idiot, because the audience is several steps ahead of her and was wondering how she's not already figured it out yet. And this would have just been easily solved by just deleting this scene and making sure that we are revealed the same information at the same time as Phoebe. But thirdly, on a fundamental level, I think this plotline doesn't really gel with all the other stuff in the movie. Ghostbusters is a comedy franchise after all, but these scenes harken closer spiritually to a lot of the stuff in Afterlife. It has a more dramatic bent to it, and the film devotes a lot of time to these characters for these scenes to breathe and try and build a relationship between the two of them and with the audience. But I think neglecting the humour in these scenes was a mistake, because that's an easy way of getting into people's hearts by making them laugh, and that means that the emotional scenes later on would have hit harder. They could have had some more sparky banter between these two characters and still made it feel like it was in keeping with the rest of the movie. But every time it cuts to this plotline, it feels like the movie hits the brakes really hard, and it increases the disjointed feel that the movie has. And this storyline's failure is so unfortunate because it's so pivotal to the entire movie's plot. You can't get rid of these scenes in editing, they're foundational to the story, and so that means the movie is stuck with them, despite the efforts of two performers trying their best, but the writing is just simply not up to par here. It wants to have this coming of age energy, and it just doesn't work. As much as I want Ghostbusters to try new things, and this is a valiant attempt at that, sometimes you fail at doing those new things, and that's what's happened here. And this tangle of plots also shortchanges the film's antagonist, Goraka. The film's opening title sequence is actually genuinely eerie, this period sequence where firemen, who are actually in the future Ghostbusters firehouse, come to a scene and find everyone frozen inside. The idea of it just uses fear to just freeze you up from the inside, there's something genuinely quite terrifying about that, and I think they want to put the horror elements back at the forefront here, and periodically there are some nice little jump and boo moments. It is a ghost house after all, but the movie keeps forgetting about this plotline because it's so distracted by other stuff that it doesn't give enough time for this antagonist. Goraka doesn't really come to prominence until the final act of the movie, and that means that it's very late for him to really do anything. The climax of the movie is meant to be this big citywide disaster as everything is getting covered in ice, but in execution it actually feels relatively small because much of it takes place inside the Ghostbusters firehouse, because clearly they shot this on a studio soundstage, and this diminishes the threat of the main villain, unfortunately, despite the fact the movie went to some pains to set him up as being genuinely intimidating and actually a little bit scary. I think the film should have focused on the central plotline more than it actually does. Ghostbusters, to me, at present, feels like it's caught between the spectres of its past and its future. I mean, the franchise is already in a bit of a weird space because it started as a comedy franchise and now it's being reconfigured into the modern language of the cinematic universe. It feels like the whole franchise is trying to find its new identity, and Frozen Empire feels like a transitionatory sequel. It feels like it's setting up the pathways for what it could become in the future, and there is quite a bit of new stuff introduced in this movie. Some of it works, some of it doesn't, but it still can't let go of the past, and it is holding it back and weighing it down at this point. I keep saying this about Ghostbusters, but at some point it has to leave the original 1984 film behind. It's 40 years ago. If this franchise is going to have a future, I do think that, for the most part, it's going to have to put all that into the trap and just let it go. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or my YouTube Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can help me bust some ghosts at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can simply like, share and subscribe, it all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.